The town of Eldon Grove nestled quietly beneath ancient forest canopies, where winter blanketed rooftops in a gentle frost, and summer perfumed the air with wildflowers. Life in this small town moved slowly, so slowly that morning birdsong echoed farther than usual, and strangers could easily count each toll of the church bell drifting through the breeze. In a quiet corner near the edge of town stood a white-painted wooden house, where time seemed to have stopped altogether since the day crimson flames drowned out every last echo of laughter from the little family inside. Lyra, a 6-year-old girl, had lived in that house with her grandparents, Edith and Franklin, ever since her parents, Isaac and Mira, perished in a devastating forest fire. Both had been top search and rescue dog trainers in the region. They led a skilled team of German shepherds, saving countless lives from floods, earthquakes, and more, even earning recognition on local television. From birth, Lyra had been raised in the midst of barking, sharp commands, tough training routines, and gentle affection. She hadn't just grown up beside her parents. She'd grown up within a pack of dogs trained to be warriors with hearts. Then one stifling summer night, the forest to the south erupted in flames. Isaac and Mira rushed in with their dogs to aid the rescue teams. They never came back. The news arrived at dawn, just as the first sunlight touched the shingles of Lyra's roof. The firefighters stood on the front porch, hats in hand, eyes red, voices trembling. Edith collapsed. Franklin only clenched his fists, silent, eyes locked on the distant woods. And Lyra, she stood motionless, wide-eyed, expressionless, as though all sound had been stolen from the world. From that day forward, she didn't speak a single word. It wasn't rebellion, nor simple fear. It was a rupture, a tear so deep in her soul that it felt as though her voice had followed her parents into the flames. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't ask questions. She simply sat at the windowsill each day, staring into the misty forest, the last place she had seen the two people she loved most. Her grandparents, though aging and worn, did all they could to keep what warmth remained in the house. Edith cooked Mira's favorite recipes. Franklin read the fairy tales Isaac used to tell. But nothing stirred Lyra. She seemed to live in another dimension, one without sound, without words, and without anyone who could truly reach her. The only bridge left between Lyra and the living world was a pack of 6 German shepherds her parents had left behind. Their names were Shadow, Blitz, Nova, Ranger, Echo, and Coda, not just pets, but living remnants of her mother and father. From the moment they moved in with the grandparents, the dogs clung to Lyra like silent guardians. They didn't bark, didn't beg for attention. They simply stayed close, followed her, slept at her feet, and tracked her every breath. Every time Lyra stepped onto the porch, Shadow would be the first to rise and follow quietly. When she sat silently by the window, Nova would gently rest her head on Lyra's lap, eyes half closed as if offering warmth. Ranger and Echo lay like sentinels on either side of her bedroom door. And Coda, the youngest of the pack, always curled up at the foot of her bed each night. Each dog had its own way of comforting her, without needing to say a single word. The town carried on, the church bells rang, children laughed in the park. But for Lyra, time had stopped. The world without her parents was a strange, foreign place. Too loud, too unfamiliar, too unsafe. All she had left were these 6 devoted souls, the last soldiers guarding the fragile memory of a home once filled with joy. The little house in Eldon Grove no longer resembled a home. It had become something else, a kind of sacred shrine, where the past was protected not by walls or locks, but by silence, and where love lived on, in warm fur, gentle breathing, and 6 pairs of eyes that never stopped watching over a little girl still trying to find her way back. Since that fateful day, when every spoken word had lost meaning for Lyra, the 6 shepherds remained, never leaving her side. While her grandparents tried to comfort her with warm embraces and tearful bedtime stories, the dogs didn't try to speak, didn't attempt to explain, didn't make a sound. They simply were. And that presence, silent yet powerful, became the only thing keeping Lyra's soul from completely shattering. They were the only beings she allowed near, the only ones she let touch her, lean on her. Each dog carried a part of her parents' memory, as if every movement, every gentle lick, every gaze echoed the lingering shadows of Isaac and Mira. What her parents had trained into these dogs wasn't just skill, it was love, encoded into instinct, into action that needed no command. Shadow, the oldest, bore the calm dignity of an old father. Whenever Lyra crouched in the corner of the porch, Shadow would quietly approach, never intruding into her space, just standing close enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath. Blitz, on the other hand, patrolled the house like a sentry, from dawn until night, from before sunrise until the cold settled on his back. He never slept until Lyra's bedroom door was closed. Nova, the only female of the pack, carried a mother's instinct. She was always the first to reach Lyra when the girl cried out in her sleep. At the sound of even the faintest whimper in the night, Nova would leap silently onto the bed, slide under the blanket, and press herself against Lyra, like a living, breathing comforter. The girl often clutched her neck tightly in her dreams, as though grasping for the last breath of her mother. Echo and Ranger were inseparable. They moved together always, in sync like twin shadows. They seemed to fully understand their role as protectors, never allowing anyone near Lyra without her clear approval. Whenever someone knocked on the door, a neighbor, a doctor, a delivery worker, Echo and Ranger would position themselves firmly outside Lyra's room. Not growling, not aggressive, just standing with a gaze that was unmistakable. Do not enter. Coda, the youngest, most playful, and also the most sensitive, often found cracks in the icy walls Lyra built around herself. Even when ignored, he'd climb onto the chair beside her, lay his head on her knee, eyes round and wet like they understood sadness. Once, Lyra absent-mindedly let her hand fall and stroke Coda's fur. Franklin saw it, but said nothing. He only turned away quietly, gripping the corner of his old handkerchief. The dogs needed no language to understand her. They didn't ask questions, didn't push, didn't try to fix her. Instead, they accepted her as she was, a silent, grieving child, unable to name the vast loss in her heart. And to them, that was enough. Every morning before the sun pierced through the frosty mist, 6 canine silhouettes would line up neatly outside Lyra's bedroom door. They didn't bark, didn't scratch. They just sat there like living statues, waiting for her to open the door. Some days she didn't. Some days the door cracked open, just a sliver. But that sliver was a symbol of hope. Slowly, Lyra began sitting on the porch again, beside Shadow, staring out at the garden. She didn't talk. She didn't smile. She just sat. But in that silence, life was returning, something her grandparents thought they'd never see again. She laid her hand on Nova's back, rested her forehead against Blitz, let Ranger curl up by her feet like a soft, breathing cushion, and one day she simply fell asleep there, wrapped in a living circle of fur, curled into herself as though she were a part of the pack. To outsiders, Lyra was still the girl who doesn't speak. But to the 6 dogs, she was the center of the universe. Every footstep she took was a silent command. Every glance to the yard, a signal. Every time she opened her arms, they rushed in like waves returning to shore. They weren't pets. They were souls, guardians, who stood watch over the last fragile ember of life flickering in that little girl. No one in town truly knew what went on inside that house. But sometimes when someone walked by and saw a tiny girl seated among 6 massive shepherds, their eyes softened. They didn't ask. They didn't gossip. They simply bowed their heads slightly because, even if no one said it out loud, they all felt it. Something sacred was keeping that child from fading completely into nothingness. Though the presence of the 6 shepherds had become a shield for Lyra's fragile spirit, for Edith and Franklin, her grandparents, the harsh reality kept knocking on their door day after day. The old wooden house still stood firm amidst the forest mist, but inside, every flickering light bulb, every unpaid bill, every sudden cough in the middle of the night was a stark reminder of a truth they could no longer ignore. They no longer had the strength or means to hold everything together, no matter how much their hearts longed to. Feeding 6 large dogs consumed a significant portion of their weekly budget. Shadow was clearly aging, his legs trembled in the cold, his eyes had grown cloudy. Blitz suffered from arthritis and required constant pain medication. Lately, veterinary bills were arriving more frequently than letters from relatives. Even Franklin, as resolute as he was, could no longer deny that their pension wasn't enough to sustain 6 lives beyond their own. Each night, after Lyra had fallen asleep, the two of them would sit at the worn-out dining table. On one side, a cup of cold tea. On the other, a stack of bills, prescriptions, and bank warning letters. Edith held a pen but never wrote. She simply stared into nothing, her hands trembling, her eyes rimmed with red. Franklin sat motionless, eyes fixed on the floor, fingers tightly interlaced as if holding back something he couldn't bring himself to say. "We have to do something, Edith." His voice was rough. "Lyra needs them, but we can't carry this forever." "You think I don't know that?" she replied. There was no anger in her voice, only the pain of a grandmother crushed beneath time and age. They didn't want to make that decision, but as the dog food dwindled, as they found themselves choosing between Shadow's medication and Blitz's, and as Lyra grew increasingly attached while they felt increasingly helpless, the unthinkable began to take form in their minds. They would have to find new homes for the dogs. Not because they wanted to, but because they feared the day when no one would be left to care for the child or the animals if they fell first. That morning, the sky was gray and heavy. The sun was swallowed behind clouds. Lyra sat by the window as usual, her eyes gazing quietly into the yard. Nova rested her chin on Lyra's knee, while Echo and Ranger lay beside her, their breathing steady. The scene was so serene, so sacred, it made Franklin's heart tighten. But he knew they could delay no longer. Franklin walked over, his head bowed, and gently placed a hand on Lyra's shoulder. "Lyra, I need you to listen to something, okay?" His voice felt as though it had crawled out of his chest. Lyra didn't turn, but Nova lifted her head. Ranger's ears twitched. The room fell so silent one could hear a pin drop. "Your grandmother and I, we've tried so hard, but we're struggling now. You know Shadow needs his medicine. So does Blitz. And they all need to be cared for." Edith entered the room, holding a handkerchief. She didn't even try to hide her tears. "My dear, we might have to let them go," she choked. "Find new homes. Somewhere people can look after them properly." The words sliced through the room like a cold wind. Lyra didn't flinch, but her hand, which had been gently stroking Nova's fur, froze. She said nothing. She simply stood, walked past her grandparents, and disappeared into her room, closing the door behind her as if sealing off the world. The sound of the latch clicking was sharp, painfully final. From that moment on, Lyra didn't leave her room. She didn't eat. She didn't respond when called. She didn't even open the door, not once. Meals left by the door went cold and untouched. The bed inside, glimpsed through a narrow crack, was unmade, messy. The room was dark, silent, and empty, like the little girl's soul. At first, the dogs continued to wait in the hallway, but soon their unease became evident. They sniffed around the door, whimpered softly, occasionally tapping their claws gently against the floor. Still, no response. Shadow sat in front of the door the longest, his eyes fixed on the wooden frame, as if awaiting a command that would never come. Blitz paced back and forth, sleepless. Nova pawed gently at the door, as if pleading. Coda shoved his nose into the narrow gap, trying to breathe into the stillness. In the wooden house of Eldon Grove, laughter had never truly returned. But this time, the silence wasn't a shelter. It was the sound of a heart breaking. And this time, it wasn't just Lyra's. Time passed slowly after Lyra closed her door. Inside the little wooden house of Eldon Grove, the air thickened, like a fog that clung to every staircase, every crack in the floorboards, every breath from the aging grandparents, and especially in the quiet eyes of 6 German shepherds, still waiting patiently outside Lyra's room. She didn't come out, didn't speak a word. She no longer appeared at the window each morning like she once did. Her room had become a fortress of grief, sealing off every form of connection. But on the other side of that wooden door, 6 loyal souls remained, refusing to leave. Not one of them moved from their place. Each morning, when the first rays of sunlight threaded through the pine branches outside, the dogs gathered in front of Lyra's door. in the same exact order as before, as if yesterday's heartbreak had never cracked anything between them. No one told them to do it. No one taught them how to wait in silence. And yet the instincts Isaac and Mira had nurtured in them seemed to go beyond training. It was devotion, deep and pure, etched into the core of who they were. Shadow, the oldest of the pack, was always the first to wake. He would sit upright before the door, his cloudy brown eyes fixed on some invisible point. Sometimes he let out a faint whimper, like whispering to someone in a dream. Blitz paced the hallway, ears twitching at every small sound from inside the room. Nova lay pressed against the door, one ear to the wooden floor, as if trying to listen for Lyra's presence. Ranger, Echo, and Coda took turns keeping watch, like a guard rotation that never ended. Then one morning, something changed. Not from Lyra, but from them. Coda was the first to act. He disappeared from the hallway for a short while. When he returned, he was carrying a green leash in his mouth, the very one Lyra used to take him to the park. He walked to the door, laid it down gently, then curled up beside it. No barking, no noise. Just a gift, a quiet reminder. The next day, Blitz brought his leash, then Echo, and so on, until each dog had placed their leash at her door. 6 leashes, 6 silent invitations, lying there in stillness, patient and unwavering, as if hoping their small, silent owner would understand. And she did. Even though Lyra didn't open the door, didn't respond, she lay awake night after night, eyes wide open in the dark, listening to the footsteps, the breathing, the faint clink of metal rings tapping against the floor. She knew they were still there, not angry, not demanding, just waiting. Then one morning, as sunlight slipped through the old curtain and spilled a soft yellow beam across the floor, Lyra got out of bed. She walked toward the door, slowly, hesitantly. Her hand reached the knob. Outside, the dogs stirred. Blitz shot upright. Nova lifted her head. Shadow didn't move, but his eyes gleamed. The door opened, not fully, just a crack. Lyra knelt down. Shadow sat there, the green leash resting between his paws. His gaze met hers, silent, steady. She didn't say anything. She simply reached out, placed her hand gently on Shadow's head, and picked up the leash. One small gesture, but in that quiet space, it rang like a bell of salvation. She stepped outside, soft and slow. The 6 shepherds instinctively formed a natural circle around her, reuniting like an old team falling into place. Lyra didn't cry, but for the first time in many weeks, her hands did not tremble. Silently, she clipped the leash onto each of them, from Shadow to Coda. At the end of the hallway, Franklin held his breath. Edith, beside him, covered her mouth, her eyes glistening. They said nothing. They didn't interrupt that moment. The moment their little granddaughter stepped by her own will out of the fog of sorrow they had feared might be permanent. The front door opened. No sunshine, no rain, nothing extraordinary. But for Lyra, it was the first time she had set foot outside since her parents died. No one spoke. The shepherds didn't bark, didn't jump. They simply walked, each step in sync, as if they had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. The dogs didn't need praise. Lyra didn't need encouragement, because in the stillness of that morning, they all knew one thing. Real love doesn't have to be spoken. It only has to stay. That morning, Eldon Grove was cleansed by the lingering night mist on the tender grass. The sky hadn't fully cleared, but faint rays of sunlight had begun threading through the branches, casting light on the lake's mirror-still surface. Lyra stepped out of the house, slow and silent like a shadow, but there was something different in her gait today. Steadier, more rhythmic, as if a long, silent drum inside her small chest had begun to beat again. The 6 shepherds strode beside her in unison, moving like one body with 6 hearts. Shadow led in front, slow and dignified. Ranger and Echo flanked her on either side. Coda, Blitz, and Nova followed behind, tails swaying gently, eyes watching Lyra's every move. No one in town could have imagined a 6-year-old girl, so quiet and withdrawn, could command an entire pack of powerful dogs with such ease, as if they were a special operations team. When they arrived at the lakeside park, it was still early. A few elderly people were doing morning exercises, and some families were strolling with their children. Everything was calm, peaceful. Lyra walked the dogs along the lake, silent as a ghost in a world slowly waking up. No one disturbed her, but everyone watched, not out of curiosity, but because there was something about the scene that held them. A tiny girl with a sorrowful face leading 6 massive, powerful dogs as naturally as breathing. It was impossible to look away. Then, it happened. Shadow stopped first. His body went rigid, ears perked up, eyes locked on a distant point across the lake. In less than a second, all the other dogs reacted. Heads lifted, tails dropped, muscles tensed. The whole formation froze like a statue. Lyra frowned, her gaze following Shadow's line of sight, and she saw it. A small boy, no older than 4, was thrashing in the icy lake. He must have slipped off the muddy bank and fallen in. No parents in sight. No one nearby had noticed. The sound of water splashing was faint, brief, then he vanished beneath the surface. Lyra didn't scream. She didn't cry. But her hand loosened. Shadow bolted like an arrow, the leash slipping from Lyra's fingers. Instantly, Blitz and Nova followed. No command needed. The 3 dogs sprinted across the grass, through the trail, and dove into the freezing water without hesitation. Echo, Coda, and Ranger charged the opposite direction, up the stone path, barking loud like alarm bells, drawing attention from the passers-by. The entire park snapped awake. In the water, Shadow swam with the speed of an athlete, sending ripples fanning out behind him. Blitz veered to the left. Nova swung around from below, forming a rescue triangle. In less than 30 seconds, Shadow reached the spot where the boy had sunk. He dove down, then resurfaced with the child's soaked shirt gripped gently in his mouth. No teeth, no harm, just secure. Nova moved in to keep the boy afloat. Blitz stayed at the rear, pushing them forward like a living paddle. With perfect coordination, like a textbook rescue drill, the 3 dogs brought the child back to shore, just as a crowd came running. One woman shouted for 911. Another wrapped her coat around the coughing child. Lyra stood frozen, her eyes wide, her heart pounding. But in that gaze was something new, an awakening, as if she had just witnessed something not only miraculous, but something that was calling her back to the world. When Shadow, Blitz, and Nova climbed out of the water, soaked but composed, the crowd erupted. "Look at that," a man whispered. "Those dogs. They knew exactly what to do." A woman holding the crying boy murmured, "They saved him, without anyone telling them to." In that moment, everyone understood. These weren't just animals trained to do tricks. These were heroes born from love, loyalty, and the legacy of 2 parents now gone. And at the center of it all stood Lyra. She didn't say a word. She simply walked up and gently placed her hand on Shadow's head. No tears, no words. Just a look, one that seemed to speak volumes, understood only by her and that dog. That day at Eldon Grove Park, the world witnessed a miracle. A miracle without wings, without lights, just 6 wet tails, and a small heart that had finally begun to beat again. News of the miraculous rescue in Eldon Grove spread faster than any wind that had ever swept through the pine forests surrounding the town. Someone at the park had captured the entire scene on video. A quiet little girl walking 6 shepherds, and then those very animals, without waiting for a single command, leaping into the lake to save a drowning child. The video was barely 2 minutes long, yet within hours it was shared thousands of times across social media. Local news aired it first. 6 dogs save a life, and the silent girl behind them. Then came national outlets, then international. Headlines sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Shepherd Squad acts like elite rescue unit. Silent for months, now she leads with a glance. A miracle in small-town Eldon Grove. People were stunned not just by the dog's skill, but by the unspoken connection between them and a girl too small to fully grasp what she had just orchestrated. But when journalists dug deeper, they uncovered a backstory that left the world breathless with emotion. The girl's name was Lyra, 6 years old. She lost both her parents in a wildfire while they were training search and rescue dogs. She hadn't spoken a word since the funeral. No smiles, no tears. The town had grown used to the sight of her at the window, a tiny silhouette surrounded by her loyal dogs like silent sentinels. And then came an even more heartbreaking truth. Lyra's grandparents, Edith and Franklin, had been considering giving the dogs away, simply because they couldn't afford their food, medicine, and long-term care. When this detail was shared in a brief post alongside the original video, what happened next was like a wave of collective emotion crashing across every platform. Parents, veterinarians, animal lovers, and rescue organizations from all over the world began flooding the comment sections with support and letters of encouragement. A mother from Canada wrote, "I lost my son in an accident, but Lyra's story warms something in my soul. She must keep those dogs no matter what." A retired firefighter from Arizona posted, "Those aren't dogs. Those are teammates. They served. Now it's our turn to serve them." A crowdfunding campaign launched less than 24 hours after the first news article, initially just to help Lyra's family keep the 6 shepherds. But the numbers quickly defied expectations. Over $20,000 was raised in just 3 days. By the end of the week, the total approached $100,000. It wasn't just money. People started mailing gifts to Lyra's cabin at the edge of the woods: premium dog food, warm winter blankets, enrichment toys, children's books, and even handwritten letters from other kids. "I don't have a dog, but if I did, I would love them just like you love yours." A veterinary clinic in a neighboring state offered lifelong free care for the shepherds. An animal welfare organization pledged to sponsor all medications and checkups for Shadow and Blitz. Pet supply companies sent offers to fully outfit Lyra's dogs for as long as she lived in Eldon Grove. The little wooden house on the forest's edge was no longer shrouded in sadness. Each morning, the breeze carried the scent of pastries gifted by neighbors. Milk cartons and baskets of fruit were left by the doorstep. Edith once cried when a stranger knocked on the door holding a large sack of dog food and simply said, "I lost my mom when I was little. I couldn't save her, but today I can do something for Lyra." And amid all the media, the attention, the donations, and the noise, Lyra still said nothing. But the change in her was undeniable. She no longer shied away from eye contact. She went outside more often. She took the dogs for walks regularly. And every night, before going to bed, she gently placed a blanket over each dog, just like her mother used to. Franklin called it the language of gratitude. Edith whispered, "She's finding her way back to the world, not because of us, but because of them." And though she never said a word, Lyra told the world something no one would ever forget. Love never dies. It simply waits for someone patient enough to reach it. In the days following the rescue, the atmosphere inside the small wooden cabin in Eldon Grove changed quietly but unmistakably. It was no longer a hiding place for a silent little girl and 6 shadowy figures guarding her sorrow. It had become a home gently rediscovering its warmth. Each morning, Lyra walked her dogs through the old wooden gate, across dew-covered grass, past fences where neighbors had begun to smile and wave. She still hadn't spoken, but her eyes shone a little brighter, her steps less hesitant. Each stride felt lighter than the one before. And then, on an entirely ordinary afternoon, something no one dared hope for quietly unfolded. Sunlight poured into the house in golden streams. Lyra sat cross-legged on the living room rug, an old threadbare patch that had witnessed countless chapters of life. Around her lay the 6 loyal shepherds, each in their own spot, forming a silent circle as if guarding a fragile flame in the wind. She wasn't doing anything special, just sitting there, her hand resting gently on Shadow, the oldest of the pack, his wise eyes grayed with time. Sunbeams filtered through the window, dancing softly across his thick fur. The room was so still, one could hear the quiet breathing of each soul within it. From the doorway, Edith and Franklin stood watching. No one said a word. Then suddenly Lyra looked up, her lips parted, and in a voice so small it nearly dissolved into the air, she whispered, "Shadow?" The room froze. Shadow immediately lifted his head, ears perked, and his faded eyes flickered like a tiny coal reignited. It was the first time he had heard his name in Lyra's voice, since the day her parents died. Lyra swallowed, blinking. Then slowly but more clearly, she continued, "Nova." "Blitz." Nova wagged her tail. Blitz stood and stepped toward her, gently nudging his head into her lap. Lyra smiled, a real, unguarded smile, the first in so long. Ranger, Echo, Coda. Each name rang out like a soft blade slicing through the silence that had bound her for months. Each name lit a candle in the darkness. The six dogs leapt toward her, tails wagging, tongues licking, soft whines echoing, not just in recognition of their names, but in joyful response to the soul that had finally returned. At the doorway, Edith covered her mouth, shoulders trembling in quiet sobs. Franklin turned away, wiping his eyes openly now, no longer trying to hide. That small room, once filled with all the grief a child could hold, was now bursting with life. Not loud, not dramatic, but deep, honest, and full of meaning. Lyra called out again, stronger this time. Shadow! The old dog pressed closer, resting his head on her shoulder, as if confirming it all. There was no need for psychologists, no therapy sessions, no complex interventions. Just a name and love had been enough. That evening, the whole family sat together at the dinner table. Not in the usual silence, but in something entirely new. Peace. Franklin shared a story about Lyra's father. Edith cooked the same soup Mira used to make. Lyra didn't say much. She just listened and nodded. Each nod was a sentence. Each glance was a quiet message. I'm coming back. Outside on the porch, six shadowy figures lay peacefully, as if they had completed the greatest mission of their lives. Not pulling someone from the water, but saving a soul from drifting away forever. And only when night blanketed Eldon Grove, the kitchen light clicked off, and the wind threaded through the pine trees, did those in the small wooden house truly realize a voice can be lost, but love, if kept long enough, will always find its way back. Since the day Lyra's voice returned, everything inside the little wooden cabin in Eldon Grove had quietly shifted, not in some dramatic fairy tale way, but in the gentlest, most delicate sense. Like a small flame kept alive in cupped hands through a long winter, it had finally grown strong enough to shine and warm enough to fill a home. Lyra didn't suddenly become a chatty child, laughing loudly or talking nonstop. She remained the soft-footed, quiet girl she'd always been, but her eyes no longer carried the fog of sorrow. She looked at the world cautiously, yes, but no longer with fear, and beside her, as always, were her six loyal companions: Shadow, Blitz, Nova, Ranger, Echo, and Coda. They were no longer just symbols of memory. They had become part of her present. They walked with her to the park, lay beside her while she read, waited outside the bathroom door, and sat by her side as she practiced writing her first words since the loss. The town of Eldon Grove changed too. No one referred to her anymore as the silent girl or the orphaned child. They now called her Brave Lyra, the girl with the miracle dogs. Strangers who once watched from afar now nodded at her each morning. Some stopped their cars just to hand her a small bouquet of flowers. Children brought her crayon drawings of Lyra and her dogs beside the lake. A local bakery hung a photo of her walking all six shepherds, captioned, "Love is instinct, it doesn't need to be taught." Life wasn't suddenly easier, but it was no longer lonely. Donations still arrived regularly. An educational foundation sent an offer to sponsor Lyra's future schooling. The town's veterinary clinic scheduled free routine checkups for Shadow and Blitz. But more importantly, Edith and Franklin no longer felt alone in their fight to protect their granddaughter's fragile heart. One afternoon, with sunlight spilling through the trees and painting the grass a golden honey hue, Lyra sat on the porch with her grandparents. The dogs sprawled lazily at their feet. She looked up at her grandfather and asked, her voice still small, but steady, "Grandpa, if Mom and Dad are in heaven, do you think they heard me say the dogs' names?" Franklin paused. Edith gently squeezed his shoulder. Then, without hesitation, he replied, "They didn't just hear you, Lyra. They smiled. Because you kept your promise." Lyra nodded, then leaned over to hug Nova's neck. The other dogs, sensing something unspoken, gathered around her, wrapping her in a living circle of warmth. And just like that, the house, once hollowed out by grief, had truly become a home again. Not because of bricks or furniture, but because within its walls, love had been preserved, memories honored, and hope rebuilt, bit by bit, through unwavering loyalty and the quiet courage of a heart that refused to give up. Lyra didn't need anyone to tell her she was strong. She didn't need the world to declare her special. Because by saying each dog's name, by stepping outside after months of silence, by choosing to love what remained, she had already proven it more clearly than any words ever could.